Honourable Member Amy Adams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very happy to stand and take a call on the first reading of the Taxation Canterbury Earthquake Measures Bill, and it really is quite heartwarming and humbling, sir, to stand in the House and hear support from all parties and the kind words of members from all around the country expressing their support for the people of Canterbury. And as my Cantabrian colleague, the Honourable Ruth Dyson, mentioned in her contribution, certainly all of the Canterbury MPs are very much grateful for what this House and the Government has done to support them, sir, and this bill is another example of that. I think the context that we have to look at this bill and measures like it in is that, obviously it's trite to say, but these were an extraordinary set of events. They were like nothing else we have ever experienced. Proportional to the size of our country, they were one of the biggest events of this type that any of us can remember. And normal rules just can't apply. We can't look to address and deal with this issue using our normal parameters. And that really was the flavour of all of the legislative response that we've made to the Canterbury earthquake, is to say that this is too big, it's too serious, we have to look at it through a new lens, for a one-off purpose-built lens. And really this bill is the taxation continuation of that line of thought. It simply wouldn't be right, sir, to penalise people or to apply a financial cost to people who have simply reacted to need as they saw it. And that's what happened in Canterbury after both of these earthquakes. There was tremendous need and people just reacted. They just did what they saw that they could do to help. And actually that is an amazing thing to watch. It's an amazing thing to be part of. And it really gives me incredible hope for the future of our country. It gives me incredible pride in our people, that when something like this happens, sir, there is no distinction, there's no division, there's no race, there's no age, there's no barrier, there's nothing. There is simply people helping people. And this bill is about saying where people have helped each other in this time of need, there is no way we as a government are now going to say, well, actually, we're going to assess you for gift duty on that, or we're going to look at the tax implications of your stock that you put aside for welfare. So I think it's the sort of thing that absolutely everybody can see the wisdom in. Certainly across the House we've heard that widespread support. It is just another way that we're working to help Canterbury in every way we can. And I want to thank the people from all over New Zealand who continue to understand that we are needing of special circumstances at this time, and for their willingness to do what they can to continue to support Canterbury as it goes through this terribly difficult period of rebuilding. I commend the bill to the House.
I call the Honourable Member Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. You've certainly had an afternoon of two halves. Anyone who's been following the debate on the television, you've had one piece of tax legislation that has been vigorously opposed by the opposition and the Greens, and then you've got another piece of tax legislation now which is through under urgency, which we absolutely support. So you get chalk and cheese here, and I suppose this is a classic example of how all parties in this Parliament work together when New Zealanders in time of need sort of expect Parliament to work together and not be curlish, but stand up for their rights and stand up for what is right. And this is what this legislation represents, Mr Speaker. As we know, that tax legislation can be very complex, and tax legislation can also be very complicated. And tax legislation can be used in a number of ways. But as this piece of legislation outlines, or as this piece of legislation stands, I should say, it has been used to provide relief, short-term relief, respite in times of need, because as Amy Adams said, and as both Clayton Cosgrove and Ruth Dyson have outlined, these are these are unusual times, Mr Speaker. The last time there was an earthquake of this size and this magnitude in this country was in Napier, the city that I come from. And there was over 250 people died in that earthquake, actually, Mr Speaker. It was an event of enormous magnitude. And it wasn't until this earthquake in Christchurch that we saw the same level of devastation in this country that we hadn't seen since 1931. And I was saying to one of my colleagues, the irony is that I was probably 3 weeks before this, I was sitting on stage commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Hawke's Bay earthquake when the Christchurch, and 2 weeks later we had the Christchurch earthquake. So, and Brendan Burns came up to Napier. My colleague Brendan Burns came to Napier. He spoke to the people of Napier. There was a guy called Robert McGregor who's in charge of our Art Deco Trust up there. Robert McGregor is sort of acknowledged, not just in Napier or New Zealand, but globally actually, as a real expert on how to reconstruct a city, how to build it up again, what needs to be done, but also on the history of Napier. And I think Brendan and Robert had a great talk about how Napier did it. Now, of course, we're talking 80 years ago, of course, and society has changed. Hardly yesterday. But we can still learn lessons from the past. There's no doubt about that. And I think Brendan took some of those lessons back.
Use the member's full name.
Sorry, Brendan Burns took some of those messages back. This does, Brendan Burns is a very good member. In fact, I think the people of Christchurch Central, I think the people of Christchurch Central are actually very lucky to have an MP like Brendan Burns, someone with the cool head and the nerves of steel, but who can actually assess the situation and work incredibly hard in the most trying of circumstances. I know when Brendan Burns and his wife Philippa Burns came up to Napier for a bit of a rest and to talk to Robert and have a look at what Napier had done, I think he said it was the first time in 6 months, well, certainly in months, that he had actually had, he'd be able to get away and had a decent sleep. And, having not lived in Christchurch, I can't understand the stress that the earthquake placed on the people of Christchurch, but talking to my colleagues, I realised that stress was absolutely enormous, and the way that Brendan and Ruth and Clayton and Leanne have dealt with that stress. So
Must use the member's full name in the chamber,
Brendan
or his
Burns,
titles.
Ruth Dyson, Clayton Cosgrove and Leanne Dalzell have coped with the stress and have really advocated incredibly hard for constituents in very trying times. Has been admirable. There's no doubt about that. This piece of legislation, I think, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think this sets a precedent, and a precedent around getting legislation through in a hurry to alleviate the stress and suffering of New Zealand citizens. I'm not too sure if I'm right there, but I believe I am right. And we must ensure, just a small note of caution here, we must ensure that this precedent is not abused. I don't think it would be. But when you do set a precedent, then there are flow-on effects. We just need to make sure that it's not abused, and I doubt that it will be. But I say that constructively, Mr. Speaker. I'm not saying that negatively. I'm just saying that we all know the magnitude of this has been significant. And so if this type of legislation is ever considered again, then we must be sure it is for an event that actually warrants it. That's all I'll say on this. There are a couple of questions. I think Ruth Dyson, the Honourable Ruth Dyson, my colleague, has raised a couple of these questions. And I'll mention these either as I go through it or maybe even in committee stage. But whilst I say we support this wholeheartedly, we would like a couple of these questions just answered, just so in our minds we know that this is actually robust legislation and that it actually really does serve the people of Christchurch, because this is the most important thing. Sorry, Canterbury. How this came about is that after the earthquake on the 22nd of February, many individuals and businesses donated money or goods or supplied at less than market value, and I think Clayton Cosgrove gave a classic case of that, to those affected by the Christchurch earthquake. Now, normally under law, Mr. Speaker, these people who supplied the goods would have to pay gift duty or maybe fringe benefit tax or other forms of taxation that go with the giving of gifts to people. Now, as I think Ruth mentioned, this is retrospective legislation, but I think one of the reasons, well, of course it's retrospective because earthquakes have happened, but I think one of the important reasons that this legislation is going through is because I'm assuming that a lot of people, and Clayton Cosgrove talked about this, a lot of people actually forgot about process, didn't understand gift duty rules, they just got up and they helped. They went into their warehouses, they went into their stores, and they said, what do I need to do to help the people of Christchurch? They didn't have any consideration for gift duty or this sort of carry on. And they mightn't have even accounted for that stock. I'm not too sure, and these will be some of the questions that we'll ask. But they mightn't have accounted for that stock. They just lifted the stock, they went out and they gave it out, and they helped people who are in need. And as mentioned, one or two of the questions we will be asking is at what level do these people have to have accounted for the stock? I mean, they're not liable for gift duty, but I know, for example, goods that have zero tax, zero GST, that are zero rate for GST, you've still got to account for those. And so I'm keen to know, and hopefully the Minister of Revenue will be able to tell us, I'm keen to know at what level the people that have given will need to account for these. Will they have to put a return in, even though there's no fiscal implications for the person themselves? The other thing that is most important, and it is most important with any tax legislation, Mr. Speaker, is the integrity of the tax system. The integrity of the tax system is something that Labor has been talking about in this House, probably most of this week actually. And just because this is a bill that helps with the relief of citizens in need, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have to have that integrity test. That integrity test is vital. So one thing I'd like to point out, for example, if an employer has given an employee money, or if they've given an employee goods, it doesn't mean that the employee is exempt from their own income tax. The employee still has to pay income tax, as does everyone around the country, if they are getting paid income. Yes, that's right, Mr. Cosgrove. Thank you very much. But as mentioned, and I'm hoping that the Minister will take some calls on this during committee stage, and we can bring them up then. But there's also a couple of other outcomes that are most important, and that's to ensure the tax treatment of goods donated as part of the Christchurch earthquake relief is appropriate. Now, I would never suggest that someone would donate inappropriate goods or that it would be done in an inappropriate manner. But what I am saying is that it must be considered to be appropriate, and this is what this legislation covers. And again, this comes down to the integrity of the tax system. And also that the revenue base remains sufficiently intact. So, for example, what this legislation does not do, it does not exempt employees from paying income tax. It doesn't do that. And of course, one of the most important things this piece of legislation does, and one of the most important things that any piece of legislation does, is it provides a level of certainty. Now, I suspect what happened on the a day or two or the week or the months after the earthquake, people got up and, as I mentioned, they just gave a whole lot of stuff.
That's right.
And what they probably did at some point is they went to their accountant, or at some point they were sitting down having a couple of beers with their lawyer or their next door neighbour, and their next door neighbour or their wife or their husband. Oh, wine, sorry, I thought you said their wife. Okay, wine, whatever. They were having a drink, probably a stiff whiskey.
Careful.
And they were told, goodness me, do you know the tax implications of what has happened? And they went, oh, shivers, that's the last thing I was thinking about. And this is why the IRD actually received a lot of calls. So we think it's a very good piece of legislation, and we commend it to the House.
Mr. Speaker. It's truth.